And again, all three of these companies have cameras that cover all of this, but what is the most important cameras for these companies to get right? And it's at 3 different tiers. Sony, Canon, and Nikon are not as competitive as you might think. I was watching Brandon Washington's live stream recently, him and Jarrell, and they were discussing what it would take for all the different manufacturers to quote-unquote win this year, okay? And the premise they're coming from is that Canon has clearly won this year, right? Because we had the R5 Mark II, we had the R1, we have the C80, and we have the C400. And so there aren't any other of these companies that are doing anything nearly, laying that much product on the market and that much good, exciting, new, powerful product on the market that goes all up and down the range of users and such as Canon has in 2024. And so what can the other manufacturers do? I used Sony for many years before I switched over primarily to Canon, which is what I use now. The main thing that I did not like about Sony is I could never, it may be a cliche, but the Sony colors thing, that's a real thing. And especially if you're pointing the cameras at people, and it's not just a color thing, but it's kind of a texture thing too, where especially with the Sony video cameras, and especially the mirrorless hybrid Sony video cameras like the A7, S3 and such, they have a non-defeatable noise reduction that even at base ISO values, so 640, 800, whatever they are in the different cameras, when you're shooting log profiles, even at base ISO values, it is interjecting this noise reduction, which gives you just enough of a smear to the image to make skin look weird. A couple things that Sony do right that Canon doesn't do is one thing that I've kind of harped on before, but I see very few people actually making a deal of it, is the use of zebras in stills mode. On Sony hybrid cameras, Sony mirrorless cameras, you can do zebras in stills mode. That's really handy because a lot of these other systems you have to rely just on a histogram. And some of them you can break out an RGB histogram, right? So you can see the red, blue, and green channel and which one of them is close to clipping. And so that's useful if you're outside because you can see where the sky is by looking at the blue channel. But Sony goes a bit further, and they have zebras that you can define just like as if you're recording video that you can then use that tool to also expose for still. So unlike a histogram, I can see when I point it at a scene, not only that something's clipping, but I can see what is clipping. And so that's the way I would use zebras, and how I use it for video usually too, is I don't put them, I know some people like to put them around middle gray or skin tones or whatever, they want to expose for. I always like to just, where's my point of no return on the highlights, and that will kind of tell me if I've captured enough latitude. Another thing I think Sony does right is they do dual symmetrical media with the CFX-A cards. And I know the counterpoint to that is they're not as fast as the CFX-B cards. So nowadays we have these cameras with enormous frame rates and data rates and such, and you can't record that to the CFX-A, but in practice, these cards are really fast. Not only are they really fast, but just like all of this media, they are progressing generationally, right? So the next generation of CFX-A will record like twice as much data as, capacity throughput as the last ones will. And I think Sony's really well positioned to be able to leverage that because their bodies are such that they can get dual redundant media, because these things are only, they're smaller than an SD card slightly. These things are only about the size of an SD card, and so they can get dual redundant CF Express A cards in their bodies, and that's something that Canon or anybody else doesn't do. But the C400 and the C80, I really want to know, and I'm sure there will be plenty of comparisons online coming up because it looks like they're kind of, they're blitzing them out now. I want to know where the image of it compares to the C70, which I'm familiar with, the R5C, which I'm familiar with. Really, those two cameras, the C70 and the R5C. I want to know what the C80 image looks like compared to the C70, the R5C. I want to know how robust it is in the grade. I want to know what the highlight behavior is. Now, the C70 does C-Log2 native, and allegedly it has more stops of dynamic range than the C400, or a more stop of dynamic range than the C400, but the C400 and the C80 have that triple base ISO thing, which the C70 does not. C70 is not really great at high ISO, whereas the C80 and C400 look like they are. So I don't know, can you get a better image out of a C70 if you are giving the sensor enough light? Maybe, but it's going to certainly be less malleable and usable at different ISOs than C400. So before I jump in and get either one of those, C400 or C80, I actually really I've really been liking using the R5C for real estate lately, shooting it 8K 60 RAW, just because I can then take that into post and interpret it as C-Log2 and get that nice C-Log2 highlight roll off, because whether the sensor can cover the C-Log2 gamma or not, C-Log2, the highlight roll-off as it approaches that white point is much more gentle and much better than C-Log3. So I like using it for that. Canon stands for the past. Nikon stands for the present. Sony stands for the future. Okay, Leo. Boy, Scotty's not going to like that comment, brother. Okay. So thank you, though, Leo, for getting me back on track, okay? So I talked about what Sony, I think, could do, to still pull out a good 2024. Those are the things look, the reason I say it like that, okay, with the Zebras thing and with the CFX, a redundant media thing and the grip thing, the reason I say it like that is because, and this is something that I really realized the more that I digested things like the C80 and the C400 and the R52 and the R1. Okay, so I have an R3, that's my daily driver, and the R1 came out, and it looks like an R3. It looks like an R3 mostly. It looks so much like an R3 that it kind of gives a bit more credit to the theory that the R3 was actually going to be the R1, when it came out, right on the heels of the Sony A1, which throttled it in a lot of ways, right? So I don't need that. I don't need the R1 because I already have an R3, and it's pretty much like an R3 Mark II, more than it's an R1. I don't think they went far enough with that design to make it the heavens have opened up and everything bows down to it, right? And then the R5 Mark II. Well, I use, the R5 Mark II. Well, I use the R5C. I've got a pair of them. I use them mostly as video cameras. I do use them as stills cameras as well from time to time, but I use them mostly as video cameras, the R5Cs. So for what I do, I live in 60 frames because I'm shooting real estate for sale, right? And so I'm living in 60 frames so I can slow everythm down, get that nice smooth motion. I'm on a gimbal. I mean, it's very formulaic, right? And that's just how you shoot real estate, is you shoot it at the high frame rate so then you can slow it in post. And the R5 Mark II came out, and it's not a video camera, and that's fine. It's a great stills camera. It's above the R5 OG in every single way, but when you start talking about video and you're looking at video, it is not the R5C's equal in some pretty key areas. The R5C will never overheat. The R5C oversamples 4K 60 and XFAVC, even though it cannot interpret that as C-Log2, but it does do 8K 60, right, in C-Log2, which I think the R5 II does as well. But my point is, and the sensors have been tested. Josh Staten did a pretty good video about, the sensors have been tested between the R5 II and the R5C. They're not much different. You know, so that's another reason that I was saying, like, kind of I was curious about the C80 and the C400, because that sure looks like an R3 sensor. And every time Canon gets asked if it is an R3 sensor, because it's a 3x2 sensor, whereas video cameras are typically 17x9 sensors, so it's taller, they kind of get spooky about it. You know, like, oh, it's a brand new device. I think it's an R3 sensor, and so does everybody else. So I have an R3. Right, and I have a pair of R5Cs, and so does the latest crop of Canon cameras. Are they attractive to me? So that's why I'm talking about these types of things, right? Like the colors and like the zebras and the media and stuff. Like that's where these camera companies are going to win these days, because the imaging on it has, I don't want to say plateaued, but it has certainly slowed a lot down in the past couple of years. Nikon, what you need to do for 2024. Build a better flagship. That's really the thing. So now that's not me throwing shade at the Z8 and Z9, because the Z8 and the Z9 are amazing cameras, but it is concerning when there are two things that are concerning about Nikon's trajectory here. Okay, and this is maybe a different opinion than a lot of people have about this. The first thing is they built the Z9, and the Z9 is baller in all kinds of ways, right? Nobody's taken anything from the Z9. I mean, it's an amazing camera. And then, in the interim, you had Canon releasing cameras, like I think the R5C was released since the Z9. You had Sony going global shutter, like with the A9 Mark III. You know, and you had these cameras that are making big leaps. I mean, the R5C is still, I think, probably the most powerful true hybrid that exists still, even with this new crop of cameras out, right? And global shutter, you know, I mean, Sony going global shutter, right? So Nikon takes 2 years after the Z9 to not develop anything new, but instead they stripped it down to a lower price point and then released the Z8. And everybody cheered, yay, because now I can afford a Z9, you know, they call it Z8 and it doesn't do all these cool things. But they didn't really develop anything, did they? You know, even the new Z6 III with their half-stacked whatever, it's like, okay. It seems to have some trouble with dynamic range. So Nikon really, you know, that's concerning to me. And the other thing that's concerning to me and exciting at the same time is them buying red, because that means that Nikon's, both things collectively, okay? Nikon taking 2 years just to strip down the Z9 to a cheaper price point, and then them buying red instead of really robustly developing video type of capabilities themselves. Both of those things show me that the Nikon's R&D isn't that great. You know, when they're not developing anything new themselves, and then they're instead buying other firms to, I mean, hey, great, now they're showing that part of it up, right? Because red's got street cred and it's legit. But Nikon needs to build a better flagship. And I'm going to get into why that is, too. All right, so let me get on to why I think these companies aren't that competitive, right? I got to thinking, okay, what is the most important camera for all of these systems? And what I found is there are 3 different levels, okay? So for Nikon, the most important camera is at the top. It's the Z8, Z9. And the reason the most important camera is at the top for Nikon is because they're playing catch-up, right? They're playing catch-up with Sony and with Canon as far as what their cameras can do, as far as market shares, as far as all this stuff. And so they have to bring it. You know, their most important camera is, this is what we can do, right? It's the Z9 and Z8. Now, for Canon, it's a little bit different, right? Because for Canon, their most important camera is the R5. And it has kind of always been that. You know, you get the sports cameras, the R1 used to be the 1D, 1DX, you know, and all those ones. And those are in the hands of pro action shooters everywhere. But it's not their most important camera. I would say Canon's most important camera always has been the 5 series cameras, right? So the 5D, the R5, the R5 II now, the R5C. I mean, these are the ones that are in the hands of commercial photographers out there. They're in the hands of wedding photographers out there. You know what I mean? Like, these are the ones. This is the most important camera for Canon to get right. And it doesn't sit at the top of the heap, right? The R1 and the 1 series cameras sit at the top of the heap. And so Canon and Nikon don't really compete because they're most important cameras, even though they both have cameras that cover, you know, both of those type of scenarios. The important cameras for each company to get right are at two different tiers. Sony, okay, we're going to go down market even a little bit more with Sony. Their most important camera is the A7 series of cameras, right? The A7 II, A7 III, A7 IV, you know, the A7 V is probably coming pretty soon. That is clearly Sony's most important camera. But it's also the most affordable full-frame camera from Sony, right? It'd be the same as like a Nikon Z6, or it'd be the same as the Canon R8. Well, maybe R8. R8's kind of weird example. The R6, we'll say, right? R6 isn't as important of a camera for Canon as the R5 is, but for Sony, the A7 series camera is the most important camera. And that's 2 tiers down, right? You've got the A1, A9 III, which are kind of co-flagships. Then you've got the R body, right? The A7, R5, you know. And then you get down to like the A7 IV, and that's their cheapest full-frame camera. So that doesn't compete with the other two because Canon's competing on the middle tier and Nikon's competing on the high tier, right? And again, all 3 of these companies have cameras that cover all of this. But what is the most important cameras for these companies to get right? And it's at 3 different tiers. And I never thought about it like that. But when I do think about it like that, it seems like maybe they're not as competitive as we might think.